Part 2. The interview. A month had passed since the reunion. Sophia found herself drowning in her own thoughts, and of the choices she had made. Her phone buzzed constantly, with messages from Brian, each one more desperate than the last. He wanted her back, wanted to patch things up after the argument they had at dinner. But Sophia's father was furious, and she could still remember the way he looked at Brian. After he had insulted her in front of their friends, enough is enough, Sophia, her father, had said that night, his face red with anger. He had always disliked Brian, despite the closeness of their families. And now, even she was beginning to see why. The dinner argument had been the final straw. After years of trying to make the relationship work, she decided it was time to end things with Brian. "Sophia, we need this interview," her assistant called out, breaking her thoughts. She looked up, startled, and saw the urgency in her assistant's eyes. "Interview?" she asked, confused. "Your friend John Michael. He's suddenly quitting. The medical world is in shock, and we need this scoop for the magazine." Sophia blinked, taken aback. John? Quitting? She felt a pang of guilt. Could it be her fault? Was she responsible for making him walk away from the career that had made him a respected figure in the medical world? But more than her personal feelings, there was her professional responsibility. As an executive of one of the biggest magazines in the country, she had to get this story. She needed to understand why someone like John, so brilliant, so determined, and at the peak of his career, would suddenly quit. Days later, she found herself on a quiet corner of the hospital John was working. It was his last days in Manila, so she hastily asked him for an interview, and maybe to clarify some things. Unfortunately, up until that moment, she hadn't prepared questions, but as she saw him walking down the stairwell, "So, why quit?" she asked as he approached. "Can I sit first?" he said as Sophie patted the spot beside her. Instead, he went for the wider part and laid down. "Off the record? It's not because of you. Don't go blaming yourself now. I know that look in your eyes." She looked away as she met his gaze, pointing the recorder to him. "I would like to address one thing, though. The thing about that K-pop girl, she just brought her grandfather for a checkup that time, but that was it. And no, she's not the reason why I'm quitting. We were never even friends," he explained. "And as for the real reason why I'm leaving now, Korea, because, well, I'd like to keep that private if you don't mind." He smiled as if pleading.
"Okay," Sophie said, smiling slightly. "So, what now? What will you do?" she continued. "I don't know yet. I think I want to stand still for a moment. Know what I mean?" he said, his expression contemplating. "I think I'd paint again," John said as Sophia scoffed. She looked at him. She never knew him to be the type. Even in high school, the short time they were together in the same school, before he was taken to another country by a rich benefactor. You never drew anything more than stick figures," she said. "I know, right? It wasn't like me, but a kid in a foreign country. Plus my peers were older than me by a large gap. They were nice though, they gave me something to do. And so that was the start." Apparently having steady hands was an advantage when making a portrait. He explained, clearly reminiscing of the time. "And maybe, I guess I'll settle down. I'm moderately wealth. 5 kids won't be a problem," he continued as he smiled to himself. "So, there's someone?" she asked, curiosity in her voice. But he didn't answer. Instead, he just got up and stretched. "First things first, I want to go home. Back to our hometown in Samar. The ocean breeze, I miss it," he said as he turned to go back upstairs. "And mangoes are in season," he added. "See you around, Ms. Fernandez," his fading voice echoed. As Sophie turned to the recorder, before she could leave the hospital, she ran into Brian with a large bouquet of flowers. She never imagined she'd get annoyed by his face. "Baby, please, just hear me out." She didn't say a word and just kept walking. He was about to reach for her hand when she noticed it and pulled away before his hand reached her. "There's nothing to talk about. I'm done with you acting like a child. I'm not your babysitter," she said, turning around, but before she did, he lunged at her. Fortunately, the guard, eyeing him for days now, caught him mid-jump. He was pleading for her to take him back, promising he'll change. "Glad you got out of that relationship. The man's unstable," one guard said as he accompanied her to her car. Apparently, Brian was coming to that hospital to rub it in John's face that Sophie chose him. The guards got involved the last time. Apparently, John tapped his liver by mistake in the parking lot. That's how John said it, and that's how the camera showed it. That was the afternoon before his argument with one of the client of Sophie's father.